Bruh. There you go. So hello. I was just thanking you for joining me and letting you know that I appreciate it. It's nice to be able to stream with you and do this in the back room of my house, put on the camera and chat away and have some of you with me. Yeah, I thought that I used to always do that, mute my mic and talk away, but it's grand. These things happen. Just a bit of trivia, a bit of lore for you. I once there's a video I did back in the day called "The Asylum Industry," and it was like a 2 hour sort of presentation of a lot of material, effectively like a PowerPoint, but kind of semi improvised. And I had to get it all together in my head, and it was difficult to do, And I did the whole 2 hour stream. It was like it was a video, but I was streaming it to in order to produce the video, and also at the time I would be too nervous to make videos. I would keep messing it up and sort of starting again. So I just said the only way I can do it is to just go live and stream at length, and that way I can't stop it. And the funny thing was is that I did a 2 hour take, and I went to click the "Thanks for joining me, good night everybody" button, and it said "Go live," and I broke my heart. It broke my heart seeing that. But basically I just, instead of taking the L, I just pressed "Go live" and literally did the whole thing again immediately after for the second time. That's what. So if you ever see that video, that was literally the second time, hot off the press, saying basically the same thing. But so I'm just still checking the sound. I'm like a bit paranoid here because I'm worried I'll still be off. Um, yeah, okay. I'll get a bit more professional as we go. I was also thinking, by the way, for those who are interested or whatever, you know, I set up a thumbnail for tonight, and as if it's a big presentation on, like, a deep academic sort of presentation on the subject, "Is Ireland in decline?" And it's kind of not, in a way. I just have a couple of talking points to go with, and then a few other things unrelated as well afterwards. And it's yeah, I'm thinking of going in future with more of a, like a show, just a general show every night with no real title on it, or maybe a different title every night. But yeah, you know what I mean. Just like people who stream a few nights a week, and they just kind of go with whatever, instead of making it a specific thing. Now, but having said that, I do want to talk about the subject to some extent. It's basically a tweet I put out like last week, or like a few days ago, maybe 4 days ago or something. And it was the snapper was on TV. Was it Paddy's Night? I think it was. And I I basically said that Ireland has. I said the decline of Ireland from then to now is hard to fathom, and it just sparked a sort of a reaction from a certain kind of liberal element online, and but they were basically trying to tell me that Ireland was awful in 1993. I have it completely wrong, and it just kind of got me thinking about that subject. For a long time, I've heard this one, that Ireland today might have its flaws and its problems, but it was so awful in the 90s and even the 80s as well, that everything now pales by comparison. Some people say that. Other people, and this is kind of the point, other people will say that it was a heaven back then. It was paradise on earth. And that's kind of where the problem comes in, because it's he said, she said a little bit. And I was born in 1991. I remember the mid 90s, I suppose. I feel like it was lovely, but that could be the bias of nostalgia. So yeah, I just what I find is people talk past each other because, of course, and this is kind of the conclusion I'm going to arrive at in a way, is that people talk past each other because one person is quoting a stat from today uh, that is better, or a better indicator than it was in the early 90s, and another person will do the same in reverse, and so you're left in a position where Yeah, two different. One person says I was around back then. I was an adult in the 80s and 90s. It was rough, it was poor, all this, and others will say, "Oh, well, we didn't have much money, but it was a heaven, much better than now." And then similarly, the two people are swapping statistics back and forth, each of which prove that one was better than the other, depending on which metric you take. And I don't know, is it kind of a philosophical question, perhaps, because, or like a political and a philosophical question in a way, because, oh, and by the way, please give this a share because I haven't shared it. I shared it earlier, haven't shared it now. That would be nice. But back to the matter. It's a political and philosophical question because, you know, on one hand, time passes and different things happen, and what people do is ascribe the passage of time to certain things when those two things aren't necessarily connected. And so we're having these kind of competing discourses on history itself in a way. So basically anything good that happened in the last 30 years is because of the advancement of gay rights and because of mass migration and because of globalization of the economy, etc., etc. And then, of course, from a person who makes that point of view, if you say, well, this, that, and the other are bad, they will, of course, say it's nothing to do with it. So, we're wrapped up in these narratives and they are deeply set in the Irish mind, I think, largely through TV discourses, RT, and all of that about the past, actually. And this is just kind of occurring to me now that I may be talking about um, the 1993 or the early 90s, but this kind of extends beyond that um, infinitely in a way. The idea that you hold the past against itself because it was the past is completely nonsensical, I think. You look at stuff like Angela's Ashes, for example. That's a big one in the Irish psyche. I mentioned RT and Hollywood as well. Things like the Angela's Ashes, Song for a Raggy Boy, all of these stories. You could go back before that even if you wanted to, but it's kind of like the bias as well as that, of course, you take Scandal from the past as well. That's the other thing. You take Scandal from the past, like and this is germane to the subject because of the Snapper. So the Snapper, I've been accused of being like a all over scatterbrained, but I don't think I actually am. If you pay attention, I'd like to keep a thread. The issue of Scandal and the Snapper are connected because apparently in the movie, which I haven't actually fully watched, if I'm being honest, I just was watching the scenery, um, a couple of scenes here and there. In the Snapper, I'm told that the girl gets, and I don't want to get my channel struck here, so RAPE, let's just call it abuse, right? The girl is apparently abused in some fashion or taken advantage of or something when she's drunk. Apparently, again, I haven't watched the whole film through. This isn't really about the film, to be honest. It's about the year, and yeah, people are holding that against me. You're saying you're glorifying that from the past, and they were saying, "Oh, the idea that someone could get away with that kind of abuse," and it struck me that in this last few years, there's been a scandal from an old folks' home. I don't know if the guy's name to my uh, to hand right now, but it's some African name, an African guy who was raping. Okay, there we go. I've said it, but he was abusing old ladies in old folks' homes, and when they tried to tell staff, the ladies were just ignored. Similarly, in the likes of Rotherham in the UK, it's complaints are seen as racist and covered up. Like cover-ups and scandals happen now based on the zeitgeist of the moment and the taboos of the moment. And we just don't have Hollywood films about them. They just get covered up. Same way the Hollywood film alleges that the previous scandal was covered up in a very sordid kind of way by the authorities. So we live, and the investigation at the moment into this African guy, there thinks that there may have been dozens of victims. A horrific story, right, of its own. But yeah, that's the thing about the past and about how the past and the narratives of it are used against the present in a sense, and to sort of dictate and direct the future as well. And I think the same goes for economics and technology, and it's a huge thing in Ireland. Basically, just going to check the chat here, see if you're all good. But yeah, it's a major thing. It's going to go to screen share now. Um, it's a major thing, and I feel like the snapper is very relevant because like I say, you could apply that all the way back through history. But let's just take, this is interesting because it's very documentable and it's in within memory. It's almost within my living memory, and I'm not that old yet. And so it's kind of like they're trying to tell you not to believe your lying eyes, your lying brain, or your lying memory, and doing these kind of tricks where if something bad happened in the past, that's because we didn't have a gender equality or something like that. So let me share. So I just want to share this little discourse I had. So this is the original tweet. I hope you don't mind me doing this. I'm just going to go through my Twitter basically and talk over it. So yeah, I said I'm watching the snapper, and a lot of people made these comments about Ireland was grim back then, and they covered up raping the snapper and all of this kind of stuff. But the most interesting one was the following few days. This guy on this Twitter user put this stuff up, and I'll read it out to you. So, and I think this is fair enough because it's an argument that gets made, and it's a good entry point into this kind of discourse. So, he said, "This is an objectively ridiculous post about the, quote, decline of Ireland, unquote, since 1993. It's a popular sentiment on far-right Twitter. They'd gladly return to a regressive society if it meant seeing fewer people who are not white." A thread on the supposed decline of Ireland. So he basically goes on to try to like pick apart my narrative in some way. I'll make this quick. I don't want to keep you all night. So anti-immigration types, I'm quoting this guy here, anti-immigration types citing the snapper are usually referring to the contrast in the rotunda, which I did specifically refer to. On the left is a screenshot of Sharon in the film, and on the right is the neonatal team in the rotunda in 2020. Racists want the rotunda and staff to look like the first photo. So yeah, I felt like that was an interesting one to get started with because I don't know, I feel like the majority of Irish people, normal people, people who don't consider themselves in any way bigoted or radically right wing or anything like that, would kind of balk at that. They would look at that and think, well, okay, you're getting started on your argument and you're trying to say that there's something wrong with the idea of a nice nurse in nice, old-fashioned, respectable uniform as well, which is a thing I've noticed, by the way, in the last few decades. The guards now look like security at Blanchardstown Shopping Centre. I don't know if you've noticed that, whereas they used to look quite regal. Again, that's an intangible. I'm going to mention intangibles a few times tonight. So yeah, they'll see that nurse, that classy nurse, Irish. And by the way, there's a doctor as well. He's Irish too. All the staff are obviously Irish in this 1993, not that long ago. And this picture on the right is reflective of the modern rotunda and basically a lot of hospitals in Ireland. In that I don't know about the majority, but if you go to use a hospital, it seems like at least a great deal of foreigners are working there, and there are very few Irish. And I just think most Irish people would, even if they don't have anything against foreigners or anything against immigration and the general sense of things, they'll just think, well, I mean, it is nice to have Irish staff. Is there something wrong with that? I think I would kind of rub them up the wrong way. And, I don't think anyone likes being in the hospital and not being able to communicate or sort of riff clearly with the doctor or nurse. And caveat that obviously, this is generalizing. You could have a unkind Irish nurse and you could have a very nice foreign nurse, obviously. But in the general scheme of things, it does add a bit of friction to the experience. And I've had it. I've had it in the past where you genuinely don't really understand what they're saying and they don't really get what you're saying. And when you make a point about your health issue to them, you wonder if they really got it what you meant, because sometimes you have to go in and spend a few minutes talking about it, say I've had this or that or whatever it is, and that's kind of a bad thing. So, and by the way, just as another caveat is, or not caveat, but side point, tangent, is that it's one of the most egregious things in the Ireland of my life that I've seen, was, and a very Orwellian, I would say. The idea in 1984 that the kids rat out the elders and betray the elders to the regime's loyalty, or whatever, to their loyalty for the regime. They will sell their parents out and monitor their parents. One of the most egregious things I found was that, like, in the 90s and 2000s, and we all probably had a bit of this in us as we were teenagers, progressive and all this, or raised in modern liberal Ireland, that the idea of a granny, this was a real trope throughout the decades, that you have a granny or something who's a bit racist and she's in the hospital and she's uncomfortable with the foreign doctor, there's a foreign doctor and this and that and the other. And the idea was that you would roll your eyes and say, oh, what a bigot. I might like my granny or my granddad, but like, that's a nasty, bigoted, aren't they so kind of horrible, really? I always thought that was the most nasty thing ever. You've lived through this country, through the majority of its history as a state, literally the 20th century. You've been through thick and thin. You've been through cold, you've been through deprivation, maybe not everybody, but you've illness, bereavement, you name it. You've been through all that, and you finally have these grandchildren. And now that the state has decided to wake up overnight and bring in 500,000 foreigners and change the entire ideology, the idea that wanting, in your most vulnerable of moments, wanting a Irish nurse or doctor who you feel comfortable and at ease with, and who you feel like has perhaps a natural affinity towards you, effectively like an extended family. That's what a nation would be. That they have you might not be their mother, but they have a mother who's kind of like you, and so they afford you a certain amount of the care that a child would afford to their parent. It's not just strictly about professionalism, it's also from the heart a little bit. And again, I'm generalizing, but this is generally true. And being worried that someone who has no connection to your culture might not quite have the same, care for you. They might do the thing, they might perform their SOPs the same way, but there might be a little bit of familiarity missing. Yeah, the idea that that was some sort of antiquated, horrible thing, and it's like, it was almost like implicit in that, it's like, oh, this kind of like, the sooner they die, the better. This nasty thing in a hospital. Like, imagine the social order being turned on you like that in your final days, and everyone rolling their eyes at you. I think it's just disgusting that that was done. And again, I'm still on this guy's first point. It's again, it's one of those things. It's like, you don't have to have any problem with foreigners. You don't have to have a problem with immigration per se. But just the idea that this guy is granting the premise that we did go from all Irish medical staff, healthcare workers in the early 90s, and probably up until, throughout the 90s, basically entirely Irish, to now where it's largely non-Irish. In the space of 20, 30 years, that's pretty crazy. Just the fact that he's criticizing me for pointing it out, but he's just, him putting it on the table is pretty crazy. But so he goes on. This is where it kind of gets interesting. He says, he goes through the perinatal mortality rate. So as far as I know, that's babies who die in utero or in the womb, I think. And he points out how in 1993, the rate was much higher than in 2020. It was like twice as high or whatever, 54% reduction. And I'll basically just fly through it. He puts with that, I've lost it. Yeah, look, infant mortality, life expectancy, you name it, those things have all gotten like twice as improved. And then he says, could be all day here discussing social progress since the 1990s regarding divorce, same-sex marriage, abortion. Progress inclusive progress inclusive of widespread recognition, blah blah blah. Okay, not really well written, can't really figure out what he's saying. But it's just kind of like, I had to point out the obvious there, and I'll fly through this. But the fact is that these things all improved anyway. I pointed this out basically to show that. I just want to check the chat and keep in touch with you here. Yeah, it's 2000 or 2000, maybe not 210 of you there. That's nice. But yeah, what are you all saying? Chatting away. I think maybe sometimes you enjoy each other's company as much or more than even being here listening to me, which it's no harm. But anyway, so I pointed out that in the same time period, effectively, some of these go from the 70s, but also the 90s. Basically, over the last couple of decades, the infant mortality, life expectancy, and all of that has improved more or less equally, if not more, in Eritrea, which the UN describes as a totalitarian dictatorship, and the Guardian described as a regime of terror. It's basically been run by this one guy, and it's completely isolationist. And it's like a dictatorship, effectively, extrajudicial killings, all of this stuff. China, an authoritarian, nominally communist state, described by the Pentagon report, or a Pentagon report, the story for another day, as a racist superpower, basically an ethno state, like an ethno state that people who are accused of being far right in the West wouldn't even think of, really, right? Myanmar, a nationalist military junta, so Buddhist sort of chauvinism, and again, extremely isolationist, and I suppose you could say repressive. They held what was at least meant to be a free and fair election, and Aung San Suu Kyi won it, and they put her under house arrest. By no means a liberal progressive place. That's basically what I'm getting at. And Iran, a revolutionary Islamic theocracy, cut off from globalization by sanctions. Again, each of these in unique ways are completely non-liberal, non-globalized, non-immigration-y regimes. I don't think any of them really have much immigration of any sort. A lot of them are ethnically chauvinistic, and in Iran's case, it's an Islamic theocracy. So you can hardly accuse them of being some bastion of gay rights over the last few decades. And as you can see, I don't actually, yeah, sorry, I'm just checking. So have I got screen share going with you guys? Because I should, but it might not be sharing. It doesn't really matter. I can't see it on YouTube, but I can see it on StreamYard. But maybe if you want to let me know. I don't think it really matters. I'm just reading off to you anyway. But I can fix that as well, perhaps. It's weird because it's on StreamYard, but I'm not seeing it on the YouTube page. Maybe let me know. Might as well take the time to stop. Oh, screen is being shared. Weird. Okay. Thanks, Kelly. It's been too long as well. I know I keep saying it to you, but we must. Yeah. Anyway, I'll give you a shout. So yeah, that's all of those regimes. And someone pointed out to me as well, of course, because this argument that this guy, whoever he is on Twitter, was trying to make against me was it was almost so weak. And it is typical of the arguments a lot of people will make to bring in these indicators. That I was kind of missing almost the more obvious argument. I brought up all these different regimes to indicate the fact that it's nothing to do with ideology or the type of governance or the type of system, the type of culture. And someone else came along then and pointed out that he said life expectancy mustn't have budged an inch prior to the era of mass immigration. Oh, wait. And then he has a graph here that goes back to 1845, which obviously dips for the famine, and then returns to a steady and consistent rise throughout literal centuries, all the way to, as you can see, the early mid 90s with a consistent pattern upwards. So that's almost a better argument than I made in the first place, to be honest. But I think both, I mean, one backs up the other. It's such a ridiculous thing. The obvious, you know, the obvious reality here is that technological progress just happens in the world. It would be like, I don't know, in Japan in the 1920s, perhaps like American cars come on the market in Japan. Maybe that's a terrible example, actually, but in one part of the world, a technology just from another, or from general scientific progress across the world, enters their market, and then they credit their last 20 years of policies and governance and cultural revolution or whatever with that thing. It's preposterous. Like I said here, it's like if Archbishop McQuaid took credit for the rural electrification of Ireland. I can't even speak tonight. I don't know what's going on. So anyway, I get into the meat of it here then, to just kind of like try to come back to reality a little bit from this BS argument that someone like that is making. Like, let's try to be rational, and let's step away from something like life expectancy going up, which it did in Rwanda and everywhere else, right? And has been consistently since the famine in Ireland. So that's just completely out of the picture now, right? So now if we're starting, rip out the page, start afresh, and you just say, we know that life expectancy is going up and more infant mortality is going down because of new pharmaceutical innovations, because of technology machines that they use in hospitals, certain nutritional things, blah, blah, blah. That's its own story for someone else. But these things just inevitably happen and create a certain amount of objective progress, the kind of stuff Steven Pinker and these people talk about, human flourishing and all of this. And so you have to start again, and you go, okay, well, let's just control for that, and then just try to compare the health service now to then in a way that wouldn't be related to those sort of neutral technologies, we'll say, or advancements, and just talk about the experience of being a hospital user now or then. So again, not to beat a dead horse here, but for example, you're using the health service now and you're using it in 1993, you're comparing it. If there's a situation where there's a specific medical device that exists now that didn't then, and so now you live, but then you didn't, those two things aren't relevant, right? Because that's, again, technology or whatever. But just in terms of the general service, where are we at? So I felt like this is fair if you compare now to then. So in 1993, Ireland had 5.5 hospital beds per 1,000 population, as compared with just 2.9 today. So 5.5, that's almost twice as much hospital beds. That's not technology. Beds are beds now as they were then. And that's it. So, and the thing is, it's germane because we have an issue with that now. I'm not bringing up some facet of a hospital or healthcare that's irrelevant to the current issue. And effectively what I'm getting at here is, did bringing in, and this is the eternal question, did bringing in a million odd foreigners or whatever it is, more probably, over the last 20 years, without asking anybody, did that make healthcare better or worse, or did it have no impact? I think there's a strong argument that when the hospital beds per 1,000 of population have halved in a situation where the population growth in Ireland has been effectively unprecedented in 20 years and is entirely due to immigration, non-Irish immigration, given that we have net Irish immigration for all that time, I think, on balance, and fertility rate below replacement. All the population growth has been foreigners, both in terms of the ones that work in hospitals, and then, of course, the higher number, which are the ones that use the hospitals. And so if back then you had 5.5 hospital beds per 1,000, and now you have almost half that now, that's a pretty objective measurement. Again, I don't think you can accuse me of doing what this other person is doing, which is I'm cherry picking some weird, irrelevant tidbit for my argument. I'm not. It's completely relevant to the situation, and it's an actual argument. And there's more. Like, um, it didn't just like start in 1993 either. In 1980, you had 9 beds per 1,000 people. So, I mean, the fact is there are arguments you can make. You can talk about investment and all of this, but there's been more investment into the healthcare service in the last 10, 15 years in Ireland than maybe there's ever been. It's one of the biggest sucks of money in the state, and yet we have less beds. So that's obviously overpopulation being the issue. I have a point here as well about, and I've mentioned this a few times lately. I was talking to a semiagog, streaming with him a few weeks ago, and I went through this. But the phenomenon in Limerick University Hospital of young girls and young teenagers dying in hospitals when they don't necessarily need to because they're oversubscribed. So I'll just read this passage. This is a girl who died in the last couple of years in Limerick. She was repeatedly then placed on a trolley in the middle of the resuscitation room as there was no room in any individual berth. An informed source said that on arrival in the resuscitation area, the girl's condition deteriorated rapidly and her mother made increasingly anguished cries for help. As medics rushed to revive the girl, another patient was transferred out of the resuscitation berth and the girl was moved into the space. However, desperate efforts by staff to revive the girl failed and she was pronounced dead. And just along with that, a headline here: over 100,000 people and young people, over 100,000 children and young people in Ireland on hospital waiting lists. 20 plus thousand children are waiting longer than a year for treatment or assessment. Anybody who's familiar with hospitals in Ireland knows how bad this is, how sort of barbaric it is. The idea that you might have stomach issues or something, which may or may not be cancer. They may or may not be something terrible. Either way, it could be affecting your daily life. I've heard plenty of stories like this. And, you expect to, and it's very jarring if you ever have personal experience with this, because you just don't imagine it could be this bad. And you go in and, you don't expect them to perform miracles, but you expect to have access to the basic healthcare, the basic checks, never mind the outcome, but just the checks, the process. And you expect to, if you're a person who hasn't been in a hospital in 10 years or ever, or whatever, you think, this is not something I do often. I expect, and I'm paying taxes into this my whole life, I expect that if I go into this thing in my hour of need, I'm going to be treated well. And, you get told, you get eyes rolled at you. Everybody's too busy, and to come back in a year and a half's time for your first consultation or whatever. And you're thinking, for all I know, I'm going to die, right? And it might sound dramatic, but people do obviously feel that way. And sometimes it's true as well, of course, and that people do die while they're waiting. Again, the statistics into healthcare in Ireland are sort of insufficient. You don't get a detailed look into now versus then. There are the odd statistic. There's the odd statistic, like I have here, the beds per 1,000 people. You get little tidbits here and there, but it's hard to put it all together. And I think there's just insufficient data. A lot of the detailed records they keep kind of go back to like 2007 or 2011, stuff like that. So it's difficult. So we're left with some basic facts like the bed availability, the crisis which has been ongoing now since basically the mass wave of people came in during the Celtic Tiger. And the thing is, boomers, I'm always giving out about boomers, but the funny thing is every time I ask one of them, I say, what was it like in the 80s and 90s? Do you remember going in the 80s and 90s to a hospital and waiting for 14 hours in a A&E room with something? I mean, they always sort of no offense, right? But they always seem to do this thing where they say, gosh, I don't know. Just kind of, I don't get an answer. I feel like it's the kind of thing, if someone asks me what it was like now in 20 years, I would be able to give them a full detail of some experience I've had, right? But anyway, that's, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying maybe it's me. But I don't think that was the case in the 80s and 90s. The early 90s. I don't see why there would have been a reason for that. I have a whole video on this as well. If you just put in YouTube Healthcare Ireland, Garrod Murphy, you'll find that too. It's from years ago. I go into some greater detail about some of this stuff. But one of the things is that we train up in Ireland some of the highest, and this is like not just my opinion, this is factual and studied and all that. Some of the highest quality medical staff in the world, and we also volume per capita of population, we train up a massive amount. Some of those are foreign international students, but a lot of them are Irish, and they're much sought after around the world. But you know, like that's a level of decline in a way as well, that we've basically swapped them out for recruits from countries like the Philippines, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Nigeria, and of course we deprive them of their talent and much needed healthcare workers as well. So there's nothing moral about it. But yeah, someone says there, someone says it was shite in the 80s, but healthcare was good. I think it's yeah, I think healthcare was probably good. Again, like I said, the technology advanced in certain ways, so some of the metrics have gone up, but I think overall it was much better. So, you know, I could go on about it. I have a video from back in the day. I might watch it myself at some point to remember what I said, to be honest, because there was like there was a one detail in specific, I think, about dentist checks that, and this is again, this is within my living memory, that for children, I think it was for children. Sorry, I'm vague on this one. But it was to do with dental checks, that you could get free dental checks for children, and it was a standard thing. And I remember, I think, getting those part of school, and I think some adults could get it and stuff too. Whereas now it's sort of it's basically just completely collapsed because of oversubscription. Ireland has one of the highest young populations in Europe. That's entirely or largely from immigration, obviously, because a lot of the immigrants are younger and they're of childbearing age, or they were in the last 20 years. So again, our population is completely juiced up via immigration. And now you can barely get a check, whereas I remember, you know, it was frequent enough and regular. And of course, someone will say, well, aren't the dentists immigrants? And it's like, well, clearly that argument doesn't sort of make sense, because someone will argue that, well, no, the solution is more immigrants. This is the same for building, construction or whatever. It's kind of like they'll say, no, the solution is more dentists, more foreign dentists to help us get out of this situation and this, that, and the other, not less. That's not what got us into the problem. It's actually the only thing that'll get us out of the problem. And it's kind of like, well, I think if that were the case, then maybe what's happening now wouldn't be happening. You know, it's crazy how someone can tell you that to your face, and yet we've been running this experiment for 20 years now, and nobody denies how bad it is. So at what point does the person trying to make this regimist argument sort of take ownership of the present, you know, in the same way as we apparently have to take ownership of the early 90s, any problem that existed then. So that's healthcare. Let's just say I haven't done some big deep dive. There's facts, loads of facts I haven't gone into. I did in a different video back in the day. You can find that. And I'm sure even that was insufficient. There's loads more. It's an endlessly complicated field, obviously. But I think we can just say for now that it's beyond question that besides technological advancements, basically in pharmaceuticals and in machinery and diagnostics, if you discount those things, because those happen everywhere and are sort of inevitable, then healthcare in Ireland has gotten, across the board, has gotten objectively not just worse, but atrociously worse from the Ireland of the Snapper, 1993 to now. So just moving on to the housing market, and I almost feel redundant here. I'm stating totally the obvious, but you know, nobody else is saying it. You can turn on RT if you want; they'll state the other things over and over again, or you can listen to me, I suppose, do the opposite. But so housing. What I'm doing tonight is healthcare and housing, basically. So home ownership by the age of 30 nearly halved in the space of a generation. This is from The Independent. Home ownership by the age of 30 has halved in the space of a generation, with the vast majority of younger adults locked out of the housing market. A new study from the ESRI think tank has revealed a stark contrast in home ownership between those born in the 60s and those born in the 80s. It tracks a continuous deadline across the decades in people managing to purchase a home by the time they reach 30. Here's the interesting part. The statistics show that over 60% of those born in the 1960s owned a home by the age of 30, but this figure fell to 39% of those for those born in the 70s and 32% of those born in the 80s. So it would have declined for the people born in the 90s and 2010s. One would assume. I mean, we know it has from like lived experience, we'll say. But you know, it's kind of like people mention like certain forms of decline in the early 90s and the 80s, famously. It basically is the alter ego of the current day. Just to reiterate that point, is that you bring up all the problems of today, of which there are many, and it's pretty bad. And the argument basically is that there's this sort of Jekyll and Hyde, or this alter ego of the 1980s that, like, yes, it might be bad now, but there was a bad that is worse than this bad, sort of thing. And I frankly just don't believe it. And I think it's a flawed way of looking at things. So anyway, 60% of those born in the 60s, so boomers effectively, right? People who are like the age of, like, if you're my age, the age of your parents, give or take, roughly there. People who are like above the age of between, what is that now? They're like 60. Yeah, they're like 60 plus now, somewhere there, years old. Am I getting that right? Yeah, 60, between 60 and 70, boomers. So yeah, it's like halved the amount of people who own a house. And just to kind of back that up a little bit, so the research from the ESRI found that nearly 80% of people over the age of 40, here's another way of looking at it, 80% of people over the age of 40 own their own home. And we don't know what the breakdown is within those, like between 40, 50, 60, 70. We know it skews older, obviously. But nearly 80% of people over the age of 40 in Ireland own their own home, but just a third of younger adults under the age of 40 are homeowners. And again, this isn't just the standard case of like, well, when you get a bit older, you get a house, and when you're a bit younger, you don't. I mean, these two facts that I've mentioned illustrate the obvious fact that, give or take, let's say roughly speaking, depending on which year and stat you look at, the amount of people under the age of 30, 40 who own a house, or from like their 20s to their 40s, who own a house has effectively halved, thereabouts, maybe. 60 down to about, you see 32%, that kind of thing. It's probably less and less and less. And there'd be more recent data, I'm sure, that would point that out. But, it's kind of like someone could say, oh, well, that's like just we're getting over the field mentality or something. People are renting and they're happy. It's like Berlin in the 90s or something. It's like we're all like the apartment they had in Ghost, you know what I mean? That's lovely penthouse in the city, this wooden floors and sparse and lovely, living the rental life like the Europeans, where you get a nice cheap rental and you have secure tenure and the place is like well maintained and all of that kind of stuff, right? And it's in the city, it's good life. It's not like that. So end of story. Everybody knows that the rental market is awful, worse than it's ever been. I would say I was going to say in Irish history, but maybe within, let's not go back to the famine, we'll say. But, the rental market is so bad that middle-class people could easily face going homeless, middle-class people with children. You could have a decent combined income or one income, whatever it is, among, let's say, a couple, never mind single people, but who are renting on a previous rate from, let's say, 2017, which even then was kind of high, but they're on that rate, which is now seen as low or reasonable. And if your landlord comes to you and says, oh, I have to renovate the house, or my granddaughter's moving back or whatever, and you go out, you could be in big trouble. If you don't have family around you that you can move in with, or some sort of extenuating positive circumstance, you could end up in a position where you're struggling to buy a house, which I've alluded to. The home ownership is low. It's not low for no reason. It's low because people just can't afford it. And then the rental market is worse because you could just end up homeless. Even if you have what ordinarily should seem like a lot of money to pay in rent, you might just not be able to find one. As in, it could go beyond the question of how much money do you have, but just that there just aren't any, depending on where you need to live for a job or family or whatever it is. You often see it within counties. There's 3 houses for rent and all this kind of stuff. How many people are competing for that? Again, you could shove a lot of money on the table and it just isn't there. So again, that would be the salve. Someone would suggest, oh, well, people own less houses, but they rent now, like it's an okay thing. No, the rental market is disastrous. So just suffice it to say, the housing market, not that you need to hear this, the housing market is catastrophic for users of it. For the owners and the capital owners, it's wonderful. And I find myself just thinking of those 2 facts. The fact that housing is so bad. I mean, and healthcare is so bad. And in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't. It probably wasn't amazing or perfect, let's say, right? But relatively speaking, those 2 things were indisputably much, much better. You sort of look at the unemployment rate and the certain other indicators that people will hold against the 80s and the 90s, hold against the past, and wonder if all of that is rendered moot. That's sort of how I feel. The other one people bring up is immigration. People were emigrating in the 80s and 90s. It was terrible. We lost our people. It's almost like an appeal to implicit nationalism. We lost our young, we lost our blood, or whatever. Immigration was so bad back then. Immigration might be an issue now, but I mean, look at 6 of one, half of the dozen of the other. You might have immigration now. It sort of has an effect on Ireland, but I mean, the alternative is you have no immigration and just everybody's going. All the young people are just leaving the country. Well, all of the young people are leaving the country. The young Irish people are leaving the country now and have been throughout the late 2010s, and for a long time. It took a long time for net Irish migration to go positive, and only by a few thousand, then it sank back again. So we've lost an absolute fortune of people during this time of modern prosperity, unlike the ugly 80s. We are just losing people. We're just replacing them with foreigners. We're actually sort of compounding the problem, because one of my theories about the unemployment of the 80s and 90s as well is that if you go back, it was like 15%. Youth unemployment was like in over 20%, which is a lot. I'm willing to grant credit where it's due. That was a lot. That's bad. And yet, if you go back to the 70s, the early 70s, unemployment was around 5%, if I'm not mistaken. And it's about that now. That's basically your minimum, really. So that kind of tells you something, doesn't it? That it's not that the past was some sort of regressive tyranny and that led to just wide-scale unemployment, because if you go even further in the past, unemployment was lower again. So it was lower, then went higher, very high, and then it came back down again. And then in 2008, and after that, it went up again, and now it's come back down again. So for someone to just say that, oh, well, mass immigration and liberal hegemony and all of these things and globalization, whatever, you name it, that those things are inextricably linked to something to do with a thriving economy leading to better outcomes or less unemployment. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't, and that's what I'm trying to get at, is that this whole standard of comparing certain parts of the past to now and trying to glean something from it about what we're doing and how what we're doing now is apparently right is just completely bonkers and doesn't make any sense. Regardless, so that's my theory. The unemployment thing is sort of moot anyway, because again, like I say, it was low, it went high, it went low and high and low and high, all throughout this period, like 50 plus years. And the mass migration thing just happened in the last 20 years, within which time period we've seen unemployment go high and low. We've seen the health service crumble, and we've seen the housing market go to shit for everybody, and prevent effectively young Irish people from forming families and from being able to just knit communities together and have a coherent society in any fashion, and mass immigration anyway. So moreover, what's the like? So I'm granting the unemployment thing at that time was the problem of that year, that moment. That just happened to be the problem for various reasons. But like, don't those things pale? And I'm sure let's just insert hypothetical two or three other bad things about that period that someone could bring up. Dublin city centre was derelict, la 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 la. Some other things, right? But aren't those things just moot when you consider that the housing just in general, the availability and ownership of housing, and the accessibility of rental housing even then, and the ownership of housing as well, plus healthcare, were both markedly, indisputably better then. It's kind of like, isn't that the more important thing? Even if unemployment is a bit high, and even if there are a few other problems, what could be more important than people being able to own a home, rent a home, and access healthcare in a reasonably humane manner? Doesn't everything else fall by the wayside? Someone could say, "Oh well, we have more TVs now. You can get a TV for cheaper, or you can do this or that or the other." Um, I just think the housing and healthcare wins the argument. Full stop. So I just want to check the chat and see how you're getting on. I'm going to leave it now because I actually have to go do something in a minute. But um, I would love to just read this chat for the night. Oh, by the way, I do have a link in my description there. It's got links, so you can. I think I've just set it up, so I wonder if it works. I don't know. There's entropy. Gosh, I'm pointing it out now, but if I don't actually read the chats, I'll be in trouble. Do you know what? Leave off the entropy. Maybe for the next stream. If you want to leave a chat for the next stream, general question, I'll get on top of it for the next one. I have set it up though, and other donation links and all of that. The reason I mentioned that as well is because I do feel like the more I like doing these anyway. And for anybody who can't contribute, don't. But for anyone who can, I do think there would be a link between that and being able to afford more time to this, basically. So that's why I put it up. And my Twitter and Telegram are there as well. But and maybe for next time we could do super chats, because I would like to be able to focus on them, but I can't just spend the whole night reading the actual chat. Anyway, so yeah, that's that argument. So I'll just go through a few more here for now. A few more indicators, and some of these are more vague. My argument rests on housing and healthcare, but the labor market, you can see here, according to socialjustice.ie, rates of unemployment high in the early 90s, low during the Celtic Tiger, high again after that, low now. What of it? We had mass immigration there, and then unemployment went up. So it's just completely moot. It's like economic metrics rise and fall, and that's it. Technology gets invented, so be it. That doesn't tell you whether mass immigration has had an effect for the better or for the worse. For that, you need to look to things that are more relevant to that, such as housing, healthcare, other things. And more importantly, our intangibles, culture, the impact it has on the society in general. So what else have we got here? Random other food inflation. I was just looking at that. Whatever. Basically, food cost a lot in the 70s, and then it cost less, the least in 2010. That's when we had the least migration. I'm not saying that that's relevant in any way, but it goes to show you that these things vacillate, they come and go. But also, one of the relevant things as well just is that, say you have, like, there's a thing in Ireland now, fuel poverty. I think it's like a third, or it could be half. I don't know. Again, I'm vague because I don't like have all these stats in my head. You can, but these, you have the internet, you can look it up if you're interested. But like, fuel poverty is this concept that people basically spend like more than a certain proportion, more than maybe 10% or something of their disposable income on trying to stay warm, and we all know that kind of thing. People are struggling to pay for their gas or their oil or whatever it is now, and putting on the extra jumpers and the rest of it. But like, it is the mass immigration thing is relevant to even those extenuating things, like fuel prices just go up and down, and food prices go up and down, and unemployment comes and goes for various other reasons, complicated. And on one sense, I say, well, mass immigration kind of, and liberal rights and gay rights and all these things and globalized economy, though they're not necessarily that connected to that stuff. That stuff just comes and goes. But in another sense, I would say they are, because at the moment we have this plantation immigration where hundreds of thousands of foreigners are being brought in literally within the last few years to Ireland to live effectively on UBI, to be put up in modular homes and all this kind of stuff. And that is relevant to fuel prices, because of course it's natural that if you're an Irish person and you're struggling to pay for fuel or for food, or there's a granny somewhere cold in her house, or you name it, that'd be one thing in the 80s and 90s, when you just think, I don't know, government are kind of corrupt, they're mismanaging things, the Arab the oil crisis or whatever it was, the thing in the 70s. There are things happening, some of which is like bad leadership, some of which is just the world being the world, but it is what it is. It's harder to take that, or your child having to emigrate, or becoming depressed at home because they can't launch in life. Those things are harder to take than in the 80s, because in the 80s you didn't have the government literally marching people in, as we've seen in Abbeyfield today, marching foreign young men in who aren't from war-torn countries or anything, just marching them in by police escort into your community by the hundred, and giving them free everything, no discussion. And this is hundreds of thousands of people. That's kind of relevant then to all the other things, because you're thinking, well, okay, so be it, fuel prices have gone up, but if the government wanted to, they could just not bring those people in and hand everyone a big fat check to pay for their stuff and help them with their few bits. And then these kind of fluctuations in markets globally and all of that would be eased. So you wouldn't be cold, and you wouldn't be hungry, and you wouldn't be a 20-year-old depressed in your house because you can't get a good, you're looking at everything, the housing and everything, and thinking, how am I going to exist here? So it is relevant. And that's one thing that they didn't have to deal with in the 80s and 90s. Things might have been bad. You might have been stuck for money, for a job, but there's a certain level of fairness in the fact that that's not happening. And again, the intangibles continue. Like I have just stuff mentioned here, like, courtesy. Like, again, I'm not trying to say one group of people are more courteous than another, but there is that kind of social fabric that exists in a reasonably homogenous, a reasonably normal country, like any other, like the way, Zambia or Egypt or whatever is more or less homogenous, in a sense. you know um those little bits of social fabric get eroded a little bit, and the national pride also gets eroded. So you have the Italian 90s and all of that. Someone mentioned that to me earlier. Those things are relevant. It might just be football, but there's a feeling of, this is our country. This is what people used to say that all the time. That's apparently now hate speech, basically, to say, well, this is my country. I have an ancestral claim. We have a culture and all of that. That kind of goes out the window a little bit. Little things as well, like the fact that 16-year-olds used to wash cars, and they'd get, for their age, a decent wage, and it would be kind of respectable. You could have a kid who is either from a poor background, who's getting a few bob for himself, and he's getting excited by the idea of making money and hard work at a young age, which gives them a certain sense of dignity. Or they're a rich kid who just wants a bit of extra money. Their dad's sending them out because it's good for them, and they're doing it too. That matters. Whereas now you have a 34-year-old Brazilian washing the car, right? And God bless him, but that's what you're getting. So you're not getting the 16-year-olds anymore. I noticed this recently. I was at a couple of places in Cork. I was at I'll just dox where it was. Doesn't really matter, obviously. But I was in the Imperial Hotel in Cork, which is a place I used to go when I was a child. My mother would go meet my aunt. They would have coffee there, and everybody be smoking cigarettes and whatever. Right? Again, that's another thing someone could hold against the past. Oh, cigarette fumes. But that was just a totally, that was just policy or whatever. But like it was nice, and you had. Sorry, I'm gone off or off track. The staff were all Irish. A lot of them were, and I remember them. They were probably UCC. A lot of them were girls, like waitresses and that, and they were probably from UCC, working part-time jobs and stuff. And of course, an American tourist or anyone going to that hotel, they get to sort of enjoy the experience. Like an American tourist coming to Ireland doesn't really come here just because it's a landmass. Like they don't come here to say, I'm on the geographic coordinates that are a territory known as Ireland officially. Like this is the landmass known as Ireland. Here I am in a hotel. Like they don't just go for that. They really would go for, the ideal is that you're sitting there, you're having your coffee, and there's a Irish girl comes along and she has a Cork accent, let's say, and you get to kind of like watch the staff do their thing and chat away to each other and chat to you, and you have a little banter with them, and that's really what you go anywhere for. That's the whole point. Again, it's an intangible, you could say, but it kind of matters. If it matters to a tourist, it also matters to a native. What I noticed is that and they were nice, like, I'm not holding it against them for who they are. They're just doing their thing. But I'm talking about the policy of it here and the mass cultural effect of it. All the staff were foreign, literally all of them. Like every last one was foreign. And they were grand and pleasant. And someone could say, oh, well, isn't that all the same? But it's like, well, no, I'm in Cork here, sitting down having a cup of coffee, where I used to go when I was a kid, and there are no Irish people. Like that matters as well. Where even are you at that point? And also the other thing too is that they are being used. The reason that's happening is, first, they're being brought in on a national level, but also the management they don't want to pay the higher wages, right? Because it wouldn't work for them, and that's the way the industry has gone. But it's like effectively that's an exploitation. Like they're finding people from abroad who are willing to settle for not lower wages, but for stagnated wages that aren't sufficient for a decent standard of living. I remember, not even that long ago, people would work in bars and restaurants in Cork and have a decent life. They might have a small car, they rent a flat in town, they go for a few beers at the weekend out by the beach, and they might go for a holiday, once a year, go for a weekend away to Edinburgh or whatever with the girlfriend, whatever it is. They had you're never going to be rich working in a restaurant or a bar, but they had a sort of a decent, towny standard of living. Living a decent sort of life. You just have a few beers and you go out after work, and you take a little holiday. You might have even have a little car flat in town. You can't imagine that now. I don't know how they live, the foreign people working there. Maybe it's just trying to save up remittances to go home. But either way, it's a system of effectively exploitation, and it creates an underclass of servants. And that's just not pleasant. It's not pleasant to have servants, in my view. That's just, call me old fashioned, right? Or whatever. I I don't feel comfortable with that. I want to feel like the person, if I go into a place and pay money for something and I see staff doing their thing, I want to feel like they're treated reasonably okay, and that they're part of a shared society with me, and that they're not some sort of underlings or some imported class of people to serve us stuff. And I can imagine the animosity that it stokes as well. I looked around me and there were a lot of boomers, probably a lot of landlords sitting around stuffing their faces. And all these foreigners are bringing, I just think, well, that's not nice, just in general, to anybody involved, really. And it's not a pleasant, it's basically not right. And it's sort of, again, to go back to the American tourist, you can imagine them, you can imagine the American tourist, if they order room service and the person comes up, it would be nice to see a 20-year-old Irish person who you think, You're not some sort of exploited servant class. You were just a young person doing what young people do. And I bet in 10 years, you're going to be, who knows, you're going to be my boss in 10 years. You're going to probably go on to do great things. Right now, you're just doing this and you're giving it you're laying it on thick. You're young and you're charming and you're excited about it because you're not being ground up in this machine. You're just doing a certain thing for a certain time and there's dignity in it. I feel like that's taken away when you just say, let's have a servant class of foreigners. Every aspect of it is bad, but that's a kind of an intangible anyway. Just to go off on the riff of 16-year-olds washing cars and young people doing jobs, that all goes away. Everything becomes about sort of this alienating exploitation, and that has an effect on society that metrics just don't measure anyway. And I've mentioned metrics of housing and healthcare. I think on the metrics we've gone down on balance, but the intangibles are what really matter as well. I'll just go through a few more things randomly. This is just to I'm almost like illustrating a point here that, well, for one, suicides and death of undetermined intent have gone up. But I wouldn't even use that so much as an argument. They've gone up a bit, but and not even that much from, let's say, the 90s. They've gone up, but it's not drastic. Point is, you could go through one indicator after another, and someone who's advocating for the current regime might find one that's kind of suits them. I might find one that suits me, but it's sort of missing the point in a way. This whole narrative about the past and about especially using the 80s and 90s or the 80s and early 90s as some sort of nightmare that was worse than now. Someone says this beats television. I appreciate that. I hope it's strange for me to sit here and ramble for like ages, and there's 200 of you there. It's very flattering, but sometimes I wonder, am I going on a bit too much? So, total fertility rate has gone down. You can make what you will of that. I'm not a person who believes that fertility rate going down is some sort of crisis in and of itself. That's a story for another day. Ireland has the highest levels of loneliness in Europe, new study finds. That's probably relevant. And growing crisis, thousands more 15-year-olds being prescribed. That is it an overuse of early childhood care, like people being put out to creches when they're 6 months old and all that? Could it be phones? Could it be this? Could it be hopelessness? Who knows? But it's not good. And it was I think it's anecdotally understood that in the early 90s, kids were happy. And I don't think that's just nostalgia. I think they kind of were, to be honest. And they might have been poor. They might have been in houses where they didn't have as much fancy stuff, some of them. And I don't even know how true that would necessarily be. But, the degradation of the overall society, I think, is probably clear. If you want to look at gay marriage as some sort of indicator for how many do that anyway in the first place, how relevant is it? It's another story. But point being, it's sort of this niche thing. Like it's like removing the blasphemy law or whatever. It's kind of like say what you want. Like there's people who are in favor of it, people who are strongly against it. But either way, more importantly, in a way, it doesn't matter really. It's not on a mass scale affecting the daily life of the society, whereas all of these other things are. The texture of daily life and the sort of crushing of a culture, what else have we got? So I think that's in a way kind of the end of it. I might have just rambled into the oblivion. I hope I could write an essay on this and sort of crystallize my thoughts. One of the reasons I do these streams as well is that I like to think that even though I ramble, I sort of like to think that in the ramble I paint a picture. I might not have a detailed PowerPoint presentation of every fact like it's a academic debate, and I might not have crystallized narrative in the way you would when you write an essay. But perhaps in spite of that, the general flowing between different ideas is based on an underlying thought. And I hope that kind of comes across. the idea of the past versus now, and the idea of justifying the current flaws of our society by referring to things that are sort of irrelevant, basically, to paint a picture again, using the past to paint a picture against the present to justify a future. It's nonsense, and I think most people understand that is the case, and that it's not just nostalgia to look back on the early 90s and think, you know what, it was better. Whether you're looking at hard things like housing and healthcare, which obviously matter more really than unemployment, more than dereliction in cities, more than various things those things have to matter the most if you're just being objective. You look at any society blindly and you would have to just say, well, we'll start with the ability to own a house or rent a house, more importantly, to own a house, and the ability to get decent, humane, expeditious healthcare. I think everything else, while they do matter, comes beneath those things. So what does that tell you? And also, like, the older people will try to tell me, you don't remember the 80s, you don't remember the 90s. I actually do remember the mid 90s. I lived at that age in Cork City, like a bang in the heart of Cork City, just literally a stone's throw from the River Lee, the North River Lee. And I was raised like being brought around all the time. I wasn't in sort of during that period, I sort of wasn't in school yet, so I was just kind of brought around all the time. So I clearly remember it. And I'll tell you, the Cork City of today is not the same. So, and also, it wasn't, I'm speaking about the mid 90s, but it wasn't like awful or derelict or any of that. Far from it, as far as I can remember. It was thriving. Everybody said hello, all of that kind of stuff. It sounds like sort of, almost like starry-eyed nostalgia, but I think it's true. Anyway, so that's just a general conversation about, is Ireland in decline, and sort of a conversation about the conversation, about how do you measure decline, and how do you ascribe what to what? What can you attribute to the changes that have happened, to the changes that have been done by the powers that be? You take those changes and you delineate which changes that happened were a consequence of that and which ones weren't. I think I mentioned, by the way, in just a tweet earlier, just to wrap up, sort of, and I think this is fair. It is in this tweet here. Sorry, I just had the thought in this one, is that, and I would challenge anyone to dispute me on this, is that the general increases in life expectancy, the increases in the decreases in infant mortality, the improvement of these indicators, I've proven it basically, that these things would have happened anyway. That's beyond dispute. The improvement of the economy, you could talk to Peter Ryan or someone about this. A lot of that was locked in the 90s anyway, before the era of mass immigration. There was some foreign direct investment. That's a whole other story. But the booming of the economy, the improvement, the modernization of Ireland, you could say, in a certain sense, in the better sense, was well on its way throughout the 90s anyway. Before 2001, 2004, whenever it was, we started bringing in like 1 million foreigners. That was already on the way. And of course, the dip happened after that, and then it got a little bit better again in terms of GDP. Point being, it was up at one point and it went down in the 80s, and then it went up again, and it went down again, went up again. There's really not a whole lot of evidence that while the GDP may have been different, the general rise and fall, the upping and downing, would have happened anyway, and a general sort of improvement of public facilities, a growing of wealth, and all of that would have happened, and then downturns would have happened, etc. Those things would have happened anyway. The increases in life expectancy would have happened, but the years-long waiting lists for a hospital wouldn't have happened without mass immigration, and 16-year-olds needlessly dying in overcrowded A&Es while their mothers scream out for help. That wouldn't have happened. and not being able to buy a house, half of the people being able to own a house under 40 than previously did. That wouldn't have happened either, unless the houses that existed and the current rate of building magically disappeared. There's no really way to make the argument that those things would have happened. Those things are directly attributable to mass immigration, whereas all of those other factors aren't directly attributable, such as life expectancy. So I suppose in what I've just stated there, that sort of, in a sense, completely unravels the entire narrative about the grim old ladies in the 90s, and it's a choice effectively between that or what we have now. And that's it, really. I'm sort of formulating my overall thesis as I speak to you, or getting it out of my mouth. It's that that's what it is. It's that they try to act like it's a choice between the negatives of the past and the positives of the present. And it's not at all. You could have probably, the negatives of the past, some of those, as lower life expectancy, inevitabilities like that, would have occurred anyway. And the downsides of what I'm referring to wouldn't have happened. So I think, I might write a bit about that. I think that's relevant. And why it's relevant too is that how are we meant to chart our way out of this if we don't have an understanding of what happened? So it's not even so much about the 80s and 90s. It's about what happened in the 2000s and since then. It's about looking at that era, which the country is sick of at the moment. 80% of people are finished with it. Liberal referendums are being rejected. It's done. The question is, now it's too early to look back on it. We'd be doing well to be looking back on it. But if we are to move beyond it, then we have to understand it for what it was, and understand it as a net negative and unique as well. Not just, oh, it was negative, but the 80s was negative too, or whatever. Those things aren't connected at all. The 80s had their own things, but that's not relevant to the conversation. What happened in that era was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. It has destroyed Ireland, and the alleged benefits that Ireland accrued from it aren't really directly attributable to it anyway. Most of the profits and all of that, of course, went to capital owners, landlords, international investment funds, all of that. So we need to understand that. I see a lot of councillors now, and all these different people are trying to make slightly politically incorrect comments to jump on the bandwagon. Easy red meat for the base in Ireland, the angry populace. And it's sort of like as if that's good enough to just sort of say, oh, this immigration policy has gone out of control. They shouldn't be bringing people in, like the asylum seeker thing. They should consult people more, that kind of stuff. It's all well and good. And it's good to have that stuff. But I think we need to formulate, it's not enough to just say, oh yeah, we'll just reduce the worst excesses of the immigration policy, or at least we'll say that we oppose them. And as the economy contracts, it kind of suits people anyway to just lay off on the immigration stuff. It suits the state a little bit, and it suits industry a little bit to kind of shed some of the labor force again. But then in 4 or 5, 6, 10 years time or whatever, just bring it back in. And even throughout that period, it would never stop anyway. It would just kind of slightly maybe lower, and the narrative changes a little bit. We need a full understanding of no, it's not just a slight excess of the last few years. People are talking about it like it's the last 2 or 3 years. I've been talking about the asylum industry since 2008. And before that, Ballahidreen and all of this was happening long before. And even before you get to the asylum thing, just the wave of migration that happened in the 2000s, or the 2010s. No, the 2000s. Am I right? Yeah. It's the entirety of it needs to change. That's when, as there's a nationalist energy now, there needs to be a deeper understanding of what the issue is, and sort of where it comes from, and what's the psyche behind it, because that's why the 80s narrative is relevant. The whole psyche behind this this post hoc justification of the era after 2000, the early 2000s, that needs to be completely unraveled. And there needs to be a discussion about getting back to, if that's possible at all at this point, getting back to some understanding of a nation state that doesn't basically operate as some sort of steroidal entity based on mass immigration. That whole concept needs to go. and the silly narratives we used to hear about Angela's ashes, and now we hear about the grim old ladies and stuff. That all needs to go as well. Maybe there was some grim stuff in the 80s, maybe there was some grim stuff in the early 90s, but that does not speak to the processes that happened in the last 20 years in Ireland, not one bit. So I'll let you go. I was gonna watch a Philip Dwyer video here as well. Maybe I'll leave it for another night. You know what, I will. Um I'm gonna leave those two things off. I kind of wanted to, but I ended up rambling longer than I said I would. And I'm only gonna start losing you now and boring you. So I will leave it there. Yeah, I'll be back soon. Again, links are below. You can support this if you want to. It will help me do this more. It's sort of like there's only so much time in the day. I have family life and stuff like that as well. So if I can be generating something from it, it makes it easier to justify. Because of course, coming on to stream for a few hours is good, but and I love the ramble, but it does also require a couple of hours. I maybe didn't do that much tonight research. I did bits and pieces, but if you want to have something to talk about, you need extra time beforehand and stuff. It does take time to do this. But anyway, that's enough from me. More importantly, I appreciate you joining me, and I will see you soon. Good night.